I'm Paul Bonin-Rodriguez.
And I'm Sarah Wilbur.
And I'm Charlotte Canning.
And welcome to the University of Texas at Austin. We would like to acknowledge that we are meeting on the indigenous lands of Turtle Island, the ancestral name for what is now called North America. We would also like to acknowledge the Alabama Coushatta, Caddo, Carrizo, Comecrudo, Coahuiltecan, Comanche, Kickapoo, Lipan Apache, Tonkawa, and Isleta del Sur Pueblo, and all the American Indian and indigenous peoples and communities who have been or become part of these lands or territories. We are also grateful to have everyone present this morning, both in person and online through our online stream.
So part of our welcome and housekeeping this morning is to remind you that there's a program, there's a QR code, there's a paper program outside, and in it you're going to find the history of the beginnings of this gathering, which was a group that formed about 5 years ago. So the history of that group is in our program, but we called ourselves the Equitable Arts Infrastructure Research Group, and the idea there was we're 9 different people, 9 different campuses in the humanities, and we're all sort of artist, scholar, hyphenate people who really wanted our scholarship to help manifest more equitable systems. And we formed during the pandemic, the onset of the pandemic, out of shared respect for each other's work, but also of deeply shared frustration with the economic and institutional kind of sledgehammering that we were seeing in our respective spaces and places. So we started meeting monthly. First we were on Zoom in fall of 2021. We gathered live every year since on our respective campuses over the years.
So about 5 years prior, Sarah and I, along with our colleague Colleen Hooper, who will be up here shortly, began presenting on arts infrastructures at the Dance Association's meeting, Dance Studies Association meeting in, well, it was then a different name, but in Pomona College. And knowing that we were going to have a tough time talking about arts policy and policy for dancers in a conference that featured the greats of modern dance, we promised snacks to anyone who would attend our session. We got 3 people, and each of them got their own big bag of potato chips.
I mean, they came for snacks, to be very clear, but we gave them policy, translation, history, you know. That's incentivization, which is what we're going to be talking about a lot today, tactical.
So a year later, we presented on another conference at another Dance Studies, Ohio State, apologies. And we didn't promise snacks that year, but we did get half a house, so we felt like there was a growing interest in the field itself. And then a year later, we went to Oxford in the UK, and we presented again as a trio, and there we encountered Charlotte and Derek, who were also on the team. And from there, we just continued to grow.
And the philosophy for the group that formed was actually not to just come up with your folks that you're already working with, but to invite people who we respect each other's work, but we were relative strangers to one another. And that curatorial strategy is a big part of how this larger gathering got organized and designed. We are really all together. Some of us have worked together before, some of you have worked together before, but each situated person works somewhere else in the arts ecology, and each person brings their own unique wisdom and experiences. Some of us work on wildly different topics. We take really different approaches to finding answers to questions, right? But it was sort of our theory that working together was what was needed. In fact, actually pushing against structures and silos that keep us apart from one another, and that's a lot of what we're going to kind of surface today. What gets in the way of working comprehensively across disciplines, across cultures, and across levels of experience? So gathering you all here and gathering folks on Zoom and making this gathering public was our way of expanding the research groups for a couple days, hopefully longer, and practicing being simultaneously expert in some things that we're going to talk about, and then deeply non-expert in other things. And that's actually kind of what we think matters most. So we're committing to making all of this learning public. We've got the live stream, public invitation here in Austin. Thank you to everyone who traveled to be here and who's from Austin, who's here, and who's zooming in and joining us online. So we're trying all together to make some of the hidden or taken for granted systems of support more legible here through our situated perspectives. Here's where we do something professorial, and I turn to Dr. Charlotte Canning for the etymology of the term infrastructure. Charlotte?
So I love it that when, you need this part, you turn to the wonky historian, right? Well, it's actually worthwhile to delve into the word infrastructure because the Latin etymology of the word concerns what's beneath the surface. So focus on infrastructure directs us to hidden things. The infra, which means below, and the structure, the building or the foundation. So mainstream examples often reference, utilities, right? Power supplies, roads, pipelines for water and sewage, or things that only enter public awareness when they break down. But the breaking down of arts venues, opportunities, revenues, and contracts, however suboptimal these systems may have been, during the pandemic, so the breakdown during the pandemic, put artists' labor and vulnerabilities in full view, no longer hidden, no longer under or below, calling on those of us who study and account historically for systemic policies and instabilities to speak out and put them in context.
So just a little bit about the structure of the following 2 days. We've got 5 discussion sections, and each of which is going to be facilitated by one member of our Equitable Arts Infrastructures Working Group. So just for those in the audience here, I wanted to ask each of our research facilitator members to rise up and give a quick wave. These are our facilitators, and will be offering their own comments. So we're seeing Colleen Hooper, Derek Miller, Michael Saiwi, and Jasmine Mahmood. They are going to be leading the conversation with a roster of very esteemed guests. And we also have 2 other members, Patricia Ybarra and Patrick McKelvey, who are here online with us and in spirit and have been equally instrumental partners in this project. So if you could see them, then you know some familiar faces. They'll be coming up and helping us with housekeeping and things like that. So the sessions are 90 minutes, and then we have a keynote conversation tonight and a plenary conversation first thing tomorrow morning. All of these things together are intended to bridge these worlds of research-driven action, policy, production, new practices, and much more robust conversation. For those in the audience who aren't contributing as a presenter but want to ask questions and offer feedback, there are 2 ways to do that. The QR codes that you see on most of the tables outside can be clicked on for you to jot down and archive questions and comments in a Google form, and we're going to aggregate those as we go. Each session will try to leave room at the end for 1 or 2 group comments from those in the house. But in case we lose that time, just keep sending you to the QR code, because the last session on Saturday for 90 minutes is an open conversation where we'll surface questions that repeat, and we'll offer folks in the room a chance to offer their worldviews. So that's the housekeeping.
So at this moment, in what may seem especially challenging for cultural professionals, or even the twilight of the word equity in a public forum, we'd like to focus on those infrastructures that have the power to withstand a stress test, those infrastructure builders who are designing for resilience and endurance and robustness, and those efforts where we still might take effort to create the cultural infrastructure we want.
So it's fallen to me to do the acknowledgments for today. And I'm very happy to express gratitude for the support that's made this event possible. I've been thinking a lot about this task because all of us have been to these events before, and it's usually this really tedious list where we try to be super dutiful, right, and clap at the end, but in our heads we're thinking, right? So I want to try to do it a little differently, particularly given the substance of our gathering today. And some of you may know Lewis Hyde's book, The Gift, which was originally published in 1979 and has been reprinted and revised multiple times. And when I was trying to explain to myself why acknowledgments should be treated differently, I turned to Hyde's book, because Hyde argues for art not as a commodity, but as a gift, because, as he puts it, it acts as an agent of transformation. So art changes us, and through that process, we experience gratitude for that change. Quote, a labor undertaken by the soul to effect transformation after a gift has been received. So we are expressing our gratitude to those who made this gathering possible, because their gifts, while not art exactly, will allow us to make things better for the arts as we all work together today and tomorrow. So I want to start with the Harry Ransom Center that is so generously hosting us. You'll meet the director, Stephen Ennis, tomorrow, but many thanks to him and to Eric Cleary, the Klein Curator of Theater and the Performing Arts. We would not be here at all if it wasn't for the research infrastructure at the University of Texas at Austin. So very special thanks go to the Vice President for Research, Dan Jaffe, who is a scientist but was happy to champion the arts, but most especially Kayla Dryden in his office, UT's first ever Research Development Officer for Arts and Humanities, who guide us every step of the way for a successful NEH grant. Closer to home for me, we are indebted to the College of Fine Arts and Dean Ramon Rivera Cervera, who cheered us on and celebrated each victory along the way. He wanted to be here, but he is tending to the infrastructure of the College of Fine Arts and is meeting with his advisory council in Puerto Rico. But there are so many people in the Department of Theater and Dance we need to thank, because they provided so much labor. So Chair Peter Carpenter, who you're about to meet, Finance Manager Eric Feldhauser, Senior Administrative Associate Michelle Belisle, Communications Specialist Cindy Patillo, and of course, and always, Assistant Director of Administration and Operations Cassie Golston. Also on our campus, we want to thank the Warfield Center and its director, Dr. Jennifer Wilkes, for their support. We feel so grateful to our friends at HowlRound, who, as Dr. Paul, as we call him, noted, that they made streaming seem like the easiest thing you could ever do. And so a warm Texas welcome to our virtual attendees. HowlRound partnered with UT's Liberal Arts Instructional Technology Services, who have also been amazing. A huge shout out and thanks to the National Captioning Institute, which is providing live captions for the entire symposium, making it even more accessible. Huge gratitude to the PPP graduate students who are here and are helping us throughout the symposium. For those of you who don't know PPP, it is the graduate program where many of us hold our appointments. If you want to know more about it, I suggest you ask those graduate students so they have a chance to practice their elevator speech. And finally, if any of you have ever spent time in Austin, even if you just arrived yesterday, you've probably noticed that parking is a nightmare. So a very special thanks to Cheryl Pfeiffer, CEO of the UT Co-op, and Board President Garrett Saunier for providing free parking. So Hyde reminds us the point of the gift is not to keep it, but to share it. As he puts it, the circulation of gifts create community. And our research group has worked for years from the idea that the arts community is strong enough to meet any challenge and affect any needed changes. The gifts that made today possible allow us to strengthen the arts community. And I'd like to close with Hyde's description of the process that faces us, thanks to the generous support we've already received. And he puts it, a gift that has the power to change us awakens part of the soul, but we cannot receive the gift until we meet it as an equal. We therefore submit ourselves to the labor of becoming like the gift. Giving a return gift is the final act in the labor of gratitude, and it is also therefore the true acceptance of the original gift. Let us do our work at the symposium worthy of the gifts that got us here and create ones of equal value to pass along. Okay, so this is like the weird, awkward transition. So pretend now I'm somebody else or different. I would like to introduce, see, I changed my voice for that. It's my great honor to introduce my friend and colleague, Dr. Peter Carpenter. He is currently the chair of theater and dance here at UT, and he holds an MFA and a PhD from UCLA. He is an award-winning choreographer with a distinctive approach to blending intricate dance vocabularies with complex texts and meta-theatrical conventions. He has been at UT since 2023 and has become so indispensable that I had to double-check that it's really only been 2 years. Here is a concrete piece of evidence of why We are so happy to have him with us at UT. Tonight is the opening of what we call the UT&T Festival, which stands for UT New Theater. And it's an exciting incubator for new works from graduate student playwrights. So he has huge responsibilities as the producer and as chair of the department for this major production opening tonight on campus. But when I asked him if he would come welcome you and open the symposium, he never hesitated. I don't know if Dr. Carpenter has read Lewis Hyde's book, but there is a moment in the conclusion that describes Dr. Carpenter's leadership exactly as I have experienced it. Hyde argues that the most important thing we can do to ensure the future of the arts is create enduring community and become what he calls good ancestors for artists of the future. Hyde says each of us must have, and these are Hyde's words, the wit and power and vision to build beyond our own days. Peter Carpenter absolutely has wit, power, and vision, and our department is the happy beneficiary of it every day. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Peter Carpenter.
That was the nicest introduction everyone's ever said for me. Thank you so much. Also, I'm just stunned that you got free parking. That's really a miracle. Good job. Hey, I'm Peter Carpenter. I'm the chair of the Department of Theater and Dance, and I'm so delighted to welcome people to University of Texas at Austin. I have been here for just under 2 years, and I absolutely love being here. It's a great place to be, despite what you might have read. It's the Department of Theater and Dance is a really fantastic place. You know, I was thinking about my remarks today and what might be useful in terms of welcoming you. What might be obvious is that as a department chair, I think about infrastructure for artistic production and artistic exploration in relationship to the students that we send out into the world. And we're sending out, you know, around 100 students a year in graduating classes. And it makes me think a little bit about my own time as a recent graduate of Northwestern University, and my time in Chicago in the beginning of my choreographic career, which really, my behavior reads as a list of what not to do. I didn't have a plan other than make as many dances as I possibly could and show them as many places as I could, all while working at a coffee shop. And the production scope conversations I was having with myself was like, what can I fit in my bag and carry on the red line? For my productions, like how much production support can I do with a week worth of tips and hopefully recoup that in a box office cut or an artist fee at the end of the week. That was my amazing calculus. So while I struggled with finding patronage for my work, I also benefited greatly and specifically and unevenly from presenters and artistic collaborators and journalism outlets and granting organizations that were predisposed to understand and appreciate the cultural coding of my work. You know, I remember at one of my very first choreographic showings after graduation when, you know, I was having a lot of questions about what kind of infrastructure might await me. A college ballet teacher came to see the performance, and I should say she was probably not there to see me. I was a terrible student. And she talked to me afterwards and was very sweet, and I'll never forget what she said to me. She said, you know, Pete, we need to find a place in the field for you. And I think she was referring to, there was something maybe a little illegible about my work. It was queer and angry and high on ideas and very low on craft. And, but she also saw something in that. And so my optimistic dream for our field is that we can find places for all of our students, right? For all of the people who want to be here and at the table. Okay, so the next two paragraphs I cut from this, and I cut it because it was things you all already know. Like it was kind of the like, oh, what's the current state of things? And gosh, it's really bad. So I'm not going to do all that. If you're curious about the specifics, the keywords are Kennedy Center, Philadelphia University of the Arts, anti-DEI mandates, several variations of that that we're all really familiar with, and I'm just not going to say. Amidst all this confusion, a few things seem really clear to me. See how I did that? Not today. It's clear to me that the conversations happening at this symposium are urgently needed and right on time. Thank you to the member of the Arts Infrastructure Working Group, Paul Bonin-Rodriguez, Charlotte Canning, and Sarah Wilbur, for your work in bringing this group here. Stunning. Thank you all for being here and joining us remotely to share your expertise and ideas. And thank you for braving travel to Texas. Amidst all this certainty, I want to be clear about reasons for hope, and I'm going to offer just 2 data points and then let you go on with your important work. I got to have dinner last night with one of my former students. Her name is Jackie Lopez, AKA Miss Funk. I met her at UCLA when I was a TA, and when she graduated, she founded a street dance company called VersaStyle. Jackie was always dear to many of us, myself included, first and foremost because she was a star, immediately clear. She was smart. She was a great, hardworking student. She was a first gen, and she was a young mother while she was doing her undergrad. And as a hip hop artist, she didn't always feel included in the same way in the department and didn't always feel seen by some of her professors. Let's flash forward. VersaStyle Dance Company is celebrating its 20th anniversary this year and is in town because they are being presented by Texas Performing Arts. And among its many credits, it was the first West Coast street dance company to perform at New York's Joyce Theater, and it is having a national and international moment. This company has an 8-person salaried payroll. That is larger than some small dance programs, right? Dance departments in academia. And I know that this is just one of the many success stories that makes up the Texas Performing Arts season every year. It's just a story that comes to my mind and feels closest to me. So I think it might be useful as we're also kind of swimming in all the things that aren't working right now, that there are people figuring it out, right? And we can learn from them too. My final word is I see hope within my department every day. I see students who are eager and smart and with a clear point of view and talented, asking great questions and making exciting work and theorizing and analyzing that work too. I see them making interdisciplinary connections and working across methodologies, sometimes encouraged by our curricular efforts, but mostly in spite of our curricular structures. I see them going out into the world and making a place for themselves in the field, right? Making a place for themselves in the field. And I'm curious about what new and revised infrastructures might emerge from the conversations over the next 2 days. Again, please accept my sincere thanks for being here. I hope you have a wonderful 2 days. I'm going to be in and out as I pretend to be a department chair. Please know I'm so enthusiastic about this sequence of conversations. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to transition and welcome you to the first discussion section, which is value and mission. I'd like to invite my fellow speakers to the stage and my co-moderator, Colleen Hooper. As the program indicates, each session is organized around a series of keywords. Today, keywords are thought of as the means to link to a desired resource through a search engine. Our use of keywords follows from the work of cultural studies theorist Raymond Williams, who posited that the analysis of keywords is not a neutral review of meanings. It is instead an exploration of the vocabulary of a crucial area of social and cultural discussion, which has been inherited within precise historical and social conditions.
And while the program gestures to the mission and vision and value statements common to the nonprofit organizing sectors, our conversations within the research group and panelists have also elicited insights on how the terms value and mission can tell a story, what drives people to do the work that they do. In this session, we have asked each panelist to speak about their work from the perspective of value and/or mission. We will begin with brief introductions and then respond to the questions in the program and engage in discussion. At the end, time permitting, we will discuss our actionable steps that we each imagine. And I am Colleen Hooper. I research how dance connects to economic and cultural transformations in the 20th and 21st centuries. I'm also an associate professor at Point Park University in the School of Dance, and I coordinate our dance education programs. My choreography is presented in a variety of site-specific and theatrical settings since 2002, so I'm also a practicing artist. And I'm also a member of a union with the Newspaper Guild of Pittsburgh, and people in my union, the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, have been on strike for over 2 years. And all of this information has really influenced the research I'm going to share with you today. I'm committed to dancers receiving a living wage and employment protections for their work, and that's something that I'm kind of exploring the different range of options that are possible for that. I propose that a combination of unionization and also increased government employment protections can benefit dancers, and I'm trying to think across the commercial, community, and nonprofit sectors. So I'm really excited to be here with you all today, and I would like to pass the introductions to Todd London.
Okay. Hello, can you hear me? Yes. Yeah. Okay. Hi. First of all, thank you, Paul and Charlotte and Sarah, for that really warm welcome and framing. And Sarah, especially for the word non-expert, because as I was preparing to speak to an intimidating room of scholars, I was fully aware of my non-expertise, and I'm really grateful to be here in the gift economy that you set up, Charlotte. I say non-expert because I am not really a scholar, though I have done research specifically about the field of theater for 35 years or so, but always from within the theater. I was a long-term artistic director, but a strange one. It was at a place called New Dramatists in New York, which is not a producing theater or a curatorial space. It's a community of writers who spend 7-year residencies developing their bodies of work in community with each other. So I never chose work, I never chose the writers who would be part of it, but my job was really to make home for them and to make sure that they always turned towards each other as each other's greatest resources. I've taught for many years. I tend to chronicle the field that I live in and work in, and I think there are 3 sort of main parts or points on that trajectory that I'll refer to today in our conversation. The bookends are one of my first jobs in New York was with Theater Communications Group, TCG, in the mid-'80s. On something that was then called the National Artistic Agenda Project, because there was a term floating at the time, starting at the NEA, that there was an artistic deficit in the American theater, that the theaters had grown top-heavy, administrative-heavy. And so the project was traveling around the country, speaking to about 250 artistic directors, asking them what they needed, what they wanted to make more artistic homes. And the book that came out of that was called The Artistic Home. That was then 86 to 88. Over the last 5 years, I've had an incredible privilege to be in a weekly conversation, and I was thinking about this with your research group, with 12 to 15 new artistic leaders in the field. And unlike that original group, which was almost all men, almost all white men, this is a group of one white man, all the rest, women and men of color and white women, who were given their leadership positions, who rose to leadership in 2018, 2019, and then had to get their theaters through the pandemic and everything. So those are sort of the bookends, and I will talk about that a little bit later. And then the other piece of the work that is relevant is a collection that I worked on with my students at Yale School of Drama, mostly management students, of founding visions of American theaters from the 1880s to the 1980s. And they're just documents and letters and memoirs and things written on napkins about what people wanted from their theaters. And that's a very powerful part of the work for me. But the main place I come from is living among playwrights and other independent artists and trying to understand how a field can be more hospitable for them.
I'm Caretha Mitchell. I use she, her pronouns. I am absolutely thrilled to be here. Many thanks to all of the organizers and everyone participating. I am a professor of English, and what I like to say is that that means that I care about literature, but it also means that I really care about discourses and practices, words and deeds. What is most commonly said and done? Because that will show you the culture of any space that you're in. So I would say that that is the place that I come to in terms of my investments here. We make the meaning of our lives with the stories we tell. And so part of what I find so compelling about what you all have done and continue to model for us and encourage us to do is to really take the reins and be deliberate about the stories that we want to tell. And the investment that you all have made in thinking about the infrastructure, what's underpinning the ability to tell those stories is very much what brings me to. The only other thing I want to say is that when I think about the power of storytelling, you know, my first book is called Living with Lynching, and so that was an investigation of plays about lynching written before 1930. And I guess that's one of the ways that I really came to appreciate that your storytelling practices, if they can really take advantage of embodiment, right? If you can communicate not simply with your words, but also with gesture, expression, and just our bodies. So theater helped me appreciate the storytelling power that would involve our embodiment. And I would say that's another kind of investment I have in what you all have been doing all these years.
My turn. Thank you for having me. My name is Adam Fong. My background's in music, where I've worked as a composer and performer, producer, curator, and most recently as executive director of the Center for New Music, which is a nonprofit I co-founded in 2012. Since 2018, I've served as one of 3 program officers in the Performing Arts program at the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. Hewlett's a large foundation that makes grants across several program areas, and one of those is the performing arts, so that's the perspective that I hope to bring to our conversation today about value and mission. So to speak briefly about Hewlett, the core belief of our program is that the arts are essential for individuals and communities to thrive. The foundation has supported the role of the arts in community life since it began in the 1960s. And our work is focused on benefiting people in our home region, which is the San Francisco Bay Area. So my perspective is primarily informed by work taking place in that area. As you might expect, the program strategies have shifted over time as the arts ecosystem and the region has evolved. Our current big picture goal is a complex one that speaks to the nuanced relationship that we observe between the performing arts and life in the 10 counties that we serve. Our aim is to ensure that Bay Area communities honor and support their own and each other's artistic and cultural vibrancy, and the power of the arts and artists to advance individual self-expression and collective self-determination. So currently, we seek to advance that goal through 3 distinct strategies. The strategy that I lead and that I'll say more about today is focused on benefiting artists and culture bearers in the region. So this is a relatively new line of work for the program that acknowledges the really unprecedented challenges that we think artists are facing. In our region, they're really pushed to the edge by rising rents, by rapid technological change, and turmoil in all of the systems of artist support that the field has invested in up to now. So the goal of the artist strategy is to ensure that Bay Area artists and culture bearers shape and benefit from the services, policies, and practices that most impact their creative agency and economic well-being. So with that goal in mind, my hope and my intention today is to share a few of the promising examples of organizations whose value speaks to the role of artists in local communities and the methods that seem to be meeting their present-day needs. The implications for our collective visions of equitable infrastructure may or may not be clear. They certainly won't be clear coming from me. So hopefully we can generate that together. But our belief really is that by affirming the central role of artists and culture bearers, we'll be able to affirm the connection between the performing arts and society at large.
I'm Paul Bonin-Rodriguez. I'm a professor in the School of Music, Theater, and Dance at the University of Michigan, where I work between theater and drama and the Excellence in Leadership and Entrepreneurship, or Excel Lab. I also maintain an emeritus appointment here at the University of Texas at Austin. I received news last week, so I was really excited. And that comes after 2 years of working, 20 years, sorry. 2 decades of working in the Performances Public Practice program here at UT. I'm someone who came to the Academy as a writer and performer. I was a working artist. I was touring. Before that, I had been a dancer. And the questions that drive my work and organizing follow from those experiences as a nationally touring artist from San Antonio, Texas, a largely Latino city, but also as a longtime professor who wants to support a nuanced understanding of cultural possibility, especially for those of us who are merging into practice and teaching. So I'm always looking for legibility around the infrastructure itself and the way that sort of someone feels that my whole body, my whole self, my whole soul can enter it and just begin to engage in a really meaningful way. And then how does my teaching do that? How do I take sometimes very flat data on a page and turn it into an experiential performance and an anticipatory performance? And also, I think, to touch on where Charlotte was speaking earlier, this idea of reciprocity. What about it is mutual? And that's sort of where I am coming to today from Value and Mission. So what we asked each of the speakers today to sort of offer to us sort of was some response to these 3 questions. And because this is the first session, I thought I'd read them for you so you know where they are. They could take even any one of them. We'd like to hear from everybody, and then we're going to sort of move into a discussion on these questions and the responses. How are artists, arts researchers, and/or arts intermediaries are defining the value in performing arts today, and to what purposes? How statements of value between arts stakeholders with differential power stand in tension or alignment with artists' creative aspirations? And in what context are alternative value propositions necessary to manifest change towards greater economic and cultural justice in the performing arts ecology? So Todd, were you first?
I feel like because you knew I was nervous, you punished me by putting me first here as well. In the nature of gift, I bring words from a great ancestor of the American Regional Theater, the founder of Arena Stage, Zelda Fitchhandler. She says, "I have a snatch of wisdom, a nugget, a pearl even, stumbled upon and shining. We must hang on to our despair. Despair creates anger, and anger creates energy, and energy turns things around. Sweet are the uses of despair. Without despair, everything is hopeless, and there is still so much to be done." I was going to read that before, but what the heck. So yes, I've been struggling with this conversation, and I want to thank Colleen and Paul and Michael for helping me. I don't really do arts policy, and the framing of the topics and questions, while familiar to me, still feels a little strange. As I said, I come from inside the theater, and my language, like the theater itself, maybe is old school. Artistic home, mutual flourishing, gift, thank you, Charlotte, and connection, and soul, a word that has come up here. My wish is for a language or a lexicon of equitable artwork that begins in the language of art, rather than in the terminology of bridges and buildings, military campaigns, and religious evangelicalism, which is where the words infrastructure and mission come from. Mission in art is, I think, intrinsic or immanent. It's something latent in the seed you plant at the end of one season as you hopefully imagine how it will flower in the next, and the next, and the next. I also believe that theater is in its bones an equitable practice, a kind of collaborative world building at its most idealistic. It requires that we bring our full selves to others and engage curiously, respectfully, even lovingly with the fullness of them. And yet, we're here today because we know that nothing gets made in a vacuum, and even the freedoms inherent in art aren't free from the systems in which they grow. Our nation's actual, rarely ideal, quite motley theater began, and this is my teaching moment, as both an alternative economy and an alternative way of being. Alternative especially to the commercial drive of Broadway and its road. The seeds for this other kind of theater, I call it art theater, were planted in the settlement houses of cities in the late 1800s and early 1900s, which sought to confirm identity within immigrant populations and to discover ways of making neighbors across those identities. This theater found artistic voice in the bohemian salons of Greenwich Village in the teens, and in the racial and regional communities from Harlem to North Dakota and North Carolina, and later in California's migrant fields and rural Mississippi, among many other places. Sometime in the late 1940s, here in Texas and in then segregated Washington, D.C., another kind of theater sprang up, a regional resident repertory theater that similarly aspired to be an everywhere else but Broadway counteroffer. As the founders of those theaters put their dreams on paper, when they did, they almost never used words like infrastructure, arts sector, core values, economic impact. Their early expressions of need and aspiration were more like I want songs sung at first light. They sought simply, impossibly, to act on the impulse to self-express or to play with their friends, to improvise and connect, to engage with the deepest parts of themselves and share what they found with the folks at home. They dreamed of companies of artists and a way to make creative lives where they lived. The impulses for these artistic urgencies were occasionally clear and full of articulate purpose. Usually they were inchoate. But even those who would build lasting monuments of art, and few, if any, actually believed they could, thought of the things they were building as works of art in and of themselves, or as Zelda Fitchhandler, who I mentioned, put it some decades into the making of Arena Stage, institution as artwork. In the late 1970s and 80s, the population of U.S. theaters of all stripes boomed, and many, not all, sought to become a permanent part of the cultural firmament. A way of talking and thinking simultaneously emerged that made sense of this striving in an unsubsidized marketplace. That was the language of strategy, branding, mission, vision, and infrastructure. As I mentioned earlier, my thinking about the field I work in has been strongly shaped by my experience in the 80s on that National Artistic Agenda project with TCG, involving hundreds of artistic directors who were almost to a man, and they were mostly men, wrestling to find creative freedom within the confines of calcifying institutions. This experience, which included my youthful sense that the conversation among these men was inauthentic, self-promoting, and driven by a kind of jockeying for clout, has been achingly bookended in the past 5 years in intimate and exceedingly authentic weekly conversations with about 15 inheritors of those massively inflexible institutions, recently appointed leaders who not only represent a very different demographic, as I mentioned, only one of them is a white man, everyone else is a woman or a man of color or a white woman, These new leaders have had to navigate their theaters through a pandemic shutdown, a national reckoning on race, and they've also had to do so without anything like the presumptive authority of their predecessors. At the same time, they had to take responsibility from the jump for the broke-down, audience-dwindling, deficit-riddled structures bequeathed unto them. As a result, almost half have left or are leaving their positions, even before this emerging hellscape of presidential return. We had a retreat at the Mellon Foundation in 2023 hosted by Stephanie Ibarra, who as artistic director of Baltimore Center Stage had been part of the original group before leaving BCS to serve as program officer at Mellon. After a day's conversation about the good, the bad, and the ugly they'd encountered in their jobs, Stephanie prompted her colleagues to focus on the things they would want to hold on to in their leadership work. What's the North Star that guides us on the pathways, she asked. More than a single star, the answers drafted on digital Post-its offered a constellation of aspiration, starting with the heart-filled, full-voiced joy and living force of creating theater. Here are just a few lines from their I Want songs. The magic of working on a show that you deeply believe in and love. Being together in space as our truest selves. A fertile space for new ideas, art and systems to be born. Creativity as a shared project. Remembering the spark that got us into the theater and trying to create conditions for others to feel the same spark. Laughter at work. Service. A cavalry of artists dedicated to their craft. The feeling when art and artists find their intended community lifting all spirits. Vulnerability, transparency, and fellowship. Joy. These are for me, if not recipes, then at least guideposts for the thing that we would build by any name. And one more from the list. Work that has room for love, of the work itself, of the thing made, and of the people who do the work with you. Thanks.
So as I thought about the question, I was really focusing on how artists and art researchers are defining value in the performing arts today and to what purposes. That is really what I'm focusing on, and it builds beautifully from what you've offered, because those goals of making space for human expression and creativity really go to the heart of what I believe is happening with artists who stay committed despite horrible conditions very often. And then for me as an arts researcher, as someone who, because I value what allows us to express ourselves as human, because I understand that we make the meaning of our lives with the stories we tell, we have to have those opportunities to tell those stories. And if we can tell those stories in embodied ways, all the better. So for me, I'm coming at it in terms of being an arts researcher who is invested in making clear the value of what artists are doing. And I would say that I'm also thinking in terms of, public-facing scholarship that, whether it's me writing in Time magazine or MSNBC or whatever, like I look at all of those as public-facing scholarship, and the whole purpose of it is to suggest that, yes, of course, my entire career, the humanities have been under attack, but that is all the more reason why it's important that as I do my work in the world, I'm making clear that it is a humanities framework, a humanities methodology that allows me to appreciate what people are doing against the worst odds. So part of what this question has me thinking about is, after 18 years at Ohio State University, about a year and a half ago, I moved to Massachusetts. And so part of what I'm thinking through is, how can I make this life transition of mine, which what I found out is that moving is traumatic. I found out that I'm a Cancer who likes to have stability and close in. And I basically, after moving, realized how often I was used to feeling like I had my act together because I suddenly never felt like I had my act together. So what I'm trying to do is very deliberately use this transitional moment as a way of thinking about how to be deliberate about supporting this creative expression and creativity that I value so much from artists. And so it's made me really pay attention to what is local, right? So in Boston, paying attention to the Huntington Theater and the Boston Athenaeum. So those are the two examples I want to talk about a little bit. I have been blown away by the fact that the Huntington has invested in a 9-play cycle. They call it the UFOT family cycle. 9 plays over 2 years. And so that has me thinking about the infrastructure. Like, what does it take to have decided that you're going to invest in this Black woman playwright who is focused on bringing attention to Nigerian immigrants, specifically in Houston. I'm born and raised in Houston. So I'm just like, look at the investment that has been made to shepherd this young playwright or new playwright or, not well-known playwright through a 9-play cycle. The other thing that it has me thinking about, and I'm speaking again in terms of how I'm trying to think about how do I enter as someone who can make legible for others the importance of what they're doing, right? So it has me thinking about the fact that you have traditional presentations of 2 or more of the plays, but you also have one at least that's being presented as a radio play or podcast. And so they're doing that live taping at the Boston Library, and then it'll become a podcast. So that has me thinking about the different venues that they're using throughout the city, the connections they had to make with leaders throughout the city of different sorts, and then the various mediums that they're using, all for the purpose of telling stories that wouldn't normally be told and that can be life-giving for so many people who wouldn't normally see themselves represented in this, endeavor of human expression and creativity. I also have been trying to think about a very old, storied institution in the Boston Athenaeum. And, it's so old that, It is a kind of quintessential New England institution. But what I'm trying to get my head around and think about how to make it legible is the way that the curators and librarians there, not only are they doing their normal job of protecting these really rare books that they have, paintings and so on, but they're also very deliberately reinterpreting their own racist history. And how do you do that in a way that, again, thinks about embodiment? So to think seriously about what it means to be in this new location, which is new to me in so many ways. I mean, born and raised in Houston, so that means that, you can drive for hours and you're still in Texas. The fact that I can be in a different state in less than an hour up there is just really a whole different reality. But again, so for me, to take seriously, okay, this is a new location. How do I think about location and the connections that make this possible? And how can I learn from the work that you all have been doing over these many years about infrastructure to make me a better interpreter of the things that I'm valuing? So, thank you.
Wow, thank you. It's still on. Great. I feel like my thoughts are going to echo Caritha's quite well, hopefully. So I'll start also by talking about a place, but I also want to recenter in the strategy goal that I spoke of and just reiterate it because it is a little wordy. But the goal of our artist strategy is all about ensuring that Bay Area artists and culture bearers shape and benefit from the services, policies, and practices that most impact their creative agency and economic well-being. And in the long term, we think that ensuring artists and culture bearers have control of their working conditions will help them realize their full potential to the benefit of all of the communities that constitute the San Francisco Bay Area. So somewhat similar to Todd's story, when we ask artists what's impeding their work, the most common answer is a pretty familiar one: the rent's too high. So the housing crisis in the Bay Area is well documented, but maybe less acknowledged is that rent for independent artists and culture bearers must also be paid for the rehearsal studios, classrooms, and performance halls where their work takes place. So this double or triple whammy really puts affordability and basic economic structures front and center. The net result, though, is ultimately an opportunity cost. It's that we lose out on an enormous amount of creative potential while artists struggle to afford the time required for their work and the space in which it might happen. So in these conditions, our foundation is expanding our support for artists. We're continuing to serve artists' present-day needs through grants, project grants, technical assistance, that sort of thing, but we're also now supporting groups that help us better understand what artists and culture bearers are facing, those who are building and scaling new models of support, and organizations that can help advance long-term system changes. So I want to highlight 3 groups that are new to us that we're excited about. And the first is the Black Arts Movement Business District Community Development Corporation. The full name's a mouthful, so I'm just going to call them BAM. So at first glance, BAM resembles many theater companies. The organization curates BAM House, which is a black box theater in downtown Oakland. Its resident theater company is the Lower Bottom Players. It's a 26-year-old troupe that produces a main, offers summer arts programming for youth, and a paid internship for young adults. BAM also produces a biennial month-long festival, BAM Fest, with theater, dance, literary events, and more. But arts and culture is just one of 5 organizing pillars for BAM. The others are housing, commerce, an online cultural archive, and human services. So as a community development corporation, BAM is able to integrate its health services with local events like the Bay Area Book Festival. It also advises an anti-displacement fund that regrants money from local real estate developers, and advocates for policies that honor the ongoing legacy of Oakland as a center for the Black Arts movement. So this adds up to really incredible reports that I get to read that include discussion of developing new plays, employing artists, alongside things like the delivery of 10,000 diapers to local families. The work of BAM simultaneously situates artists within a generational movement that might be familiar to artist scholars, but also a very local community. So in a way, I think the next organization I want to talk about does the same thing, but in a much more technical fashion. The Artist Space Trust was founded just 2 years ago, in 2023, as a joint partnership of 2 organizations, Northern California Land Trust, which is California's oldest and largest community land trust, and Vital Arts, an advocacy organization focused on the safety, housing, and well-being of artists that was founded by the parents of victims of the Ghost Ship Fire. Artist Space Trust is the first traditional community land trust in the nation that is solely focused on permanently affordable housing and creative space for artists and culture bearers. The trust is building its property portfolio through donations from other local artists, mostly elder artists, who are donating or bequeathing their homes, multi-unit housing properties, and live-work spaces. So on top of securing permanently affordable units for artists, the model also enables its new tenants to build equity as homeowners. It's a little too early, of course, to judge just how scalable the effort might be, but this is a kind of innovation that works within the housing market and the financing systems we already have. So something new that doesn't require huge policy shifts, just a practice shift. One final example I'll share is called the HOMES program, which seems to be an emerging theme here. So this is an arts and culture pilot project housed by Monument Impact, which is a local advocacy organization that works on behalf of low-income communities in Contra Costa County. HOMES, which stands for Home Offers Me Safety and Escape, uses community storytelling as a bridge between the more and less privileged people of the area. So the themes of each show, this is devised theater, obviously, echoes the organizing work of Monument Impact, telling stories about housing, immigration, and labor that come directly from locals and which illuminate the need for changes to these basic social systems. So there's two key features that I feel cut across each of these examples that I've shared. The first is that each organization builds its artistic value on top of existing social capital. So their underlying value propositions and the resulting exchanges, if we can call them that, in arts presentations, really presuppose that there is a mutual compounding of value that can occur across artistic and social realms. There are financial impacts, of course, but the financial and material impacts are really meant to follow and not lead in these formulations. The second shared feature is that it's hyperlocal, especially on the input side of the organizational model. So the Artist Space Trust is taking property from individuals. The Homes program is building stories from individual community members. And BAM is rooted in this individual identification with an artistic movement that's very specific to a place, even down to the streets and the neighborhoods. So in each case, local relationships are truly crucial to success. So a couple closing thoughts and maybe a question. I wonder if this idea about value propositions, really we have to wonder if it's not the arts value proposition that's changing, but the community context around it. There's a lot of advocates in the Bay Area that argue that individuals, networks, and movements are all more agile and more adaptable than institutions, and I think Todd is also implying the same. So if that assumption is true, my question, what does it mean for the future, especially the future governance of any infrastructure that we hope to build, buttress, or otherwise see endure?
Thank you so much, Adam. So I'm very excited to be here with you all. And the story, I'm really telling one story today, and I'm really looking at alternative value propositions created by young people. So another theme that I've sensed is kind of looking at this younger generation and seeing the work that they're doing. So I want to share a story about something that happened here in Dallas and really spend some time celebrating the accomplishments of young dancers. So, on December 8th, 2024, Dallas Black Dance Theater reached a settlement with the National Labor Relations Board, which is known and I will refer to as the NLRB, and it awarded over $560,000 to 10 dancers who were fired from the company. Company management claimed that the dancers were terminated for posting an Instagram video that violated the company's code of conduct. But the dancers asserted that their firing was retaliation for their May 29th unanimous vote to form a union with the American Guild of Musical Artists, also known as AGMA. The NLRB settlement included back pay, front pay, and compensation for damages. Dallas Black Dance Theater leadership also personally apologized to each dancer for the harm that they caused. There was a 7-page NLRB notice detailing the company's misconduct, and it was published in the Dallas Morning News for 7 days. And also, the Dallas Black Dance Theater management and employees were required to undergo labor training. So the question is, how did we get here? What was the path that led us to this settlement? To answer this question, I want to look at the value and mission statements of all of the stakeholders involved in this situation. This settlement was a result of more than 5 months of advocacy work. The dancers were fired on August 9th, 2024, and this firing became an impetus, it became a spark for a slew of actions, which included protests at the opening night of the company's 48th season, and also an NLRB complaint with almost 20 allegations of unlawful conduct. According to the NLRB website, the complaints included coercive promises of grants and benefits, threats of discharge, also issuing bargaining unit main dancers disciplinary warnings, maintaining and enforcing coercive and overly broad work rules, and effectuating a mass discharge of the remaining 10 bargaining unit main dancers, basically firing everyone. So this was part of the situation. So for a moment, I want to look at what is the NLRB's mission and how are they they working within it? According to their website, established in 1935, the National Labor Relations Board is an independent federal agency. It protects employees, employers, and unions from unfair labor practices, and it also protects the right of private sector employees to join together, with or without a union, to improve wages, benefits, and working conditions. The NLRB conducts hundreds of workplace elections and also investigates thousands of unfair labor practice charges every year. So this is the mission that we're working within for this organization. So back in October, the Dallas City Council voted to temporarily pause Dallas Black Dance Theater's funding because of this NLRB investigation. They found that what was going on was sufficient enough that they really did not want to fund Dallas Black Dance until it was sorted out. So the executive director of Dallas Black Dance Theater, Zanetta Drew, was really seeking to reassure the city council that this organization, which happens to be the oldest continuously operating professional dance company in Dallas, that they were able to uphold its mission. So I decided to take the mission from when she spoke to City Council because I found that that was more compelling than the mission that was on their website. So, quote, "Our mission at Dallas Black Dance Theater remains unchanged. We want to create and share contemporary dance in the African American experience, and we want to enrich the global community by bringing cultures together through transformative power of dance. We are committed to continuing our work and look forward to working with the city of Dallas to resolve this matter." They wanted their money back, right? However, the committee chair, Paul Ridley, expressed discomfort with how they had responded to the dancer firings, and he was alarmed by their choice to quickly hire replacement dancers. Ridley voiced his support for workers' rights to organize as a labor union, and he felt that Dallas Black Dance Theater's actions had been harmful. So after the settlement, which came through on December 8th, Dallas City Council voted to permanently cut $248,000 in city funding that had been previously allocated to Dallas Black Dance Theater. So this is permanently cut, and Dallas Council member Adam Balzaldua said that he understood that Dallas Black Dance really wanted to fight all of these allegations for wrongdoing, but he explained that this stance of fighting everything and admitting no wrongdoing was not in line with the values that the city stood for. So if we look at the City of Dallas, their website, their core values are, allegedly, empathy, ethics, excellence, engagement, and equity. So they share the equity name as of yesterday. And I argue that when Dallas Black Dance Theater fired their dancers and replaced them with new dancers while in the midst of a labor dispute, they lost sight of their mission. And then they in turn fell out of step with the values that the city of Dallas has stated. The dancers courageously stood up for themselves at great personal cost, and they organized a powerful movement to hold Dallas Black Dance Theater accountable for their actions. So this is where things get interesting. The settlement agreement actually included stipulations about Instagram. The dancers of Dallas Black Dance Instagram handle had to be changed after this December 8th settlement, and this was the venue that the dancers used to communicate with the world about their labor advocacy. So the dancers announced that they changed their Instagram handle to Dancers Deserve Better, and this was a means of expressing their journey and also their commitment to advocacy. And their stated mission is simple. It is to ensure that every dancer knows that they deserve better. End of story. And in their new biography, they do not name Dallas Black Dance Theater. They identify as, quote, dancers in Dallas, Texas who voted to unionize under AGMA and were unlawfully fired by a renowned black dance company, end quote. Following the settlement, the dancers shared a written statement. They said, "This has always been bigger than us. We voted to unionize, we fought as one through months of intimidation and retaliation, and we made a decision to move forward as one. We exposed what was happening behind closed doors, and people took to the streets and stood with us. While the settlement allows our lives to go on and also gives us a sense of much needed closure, we recognize that the fight for accountability and justice is far far from over. So on Saturday, January 11th, 2025, the Dancers Deserve Better group performed here in Austin, Texas at the AFL-CIO Martin Luther King conference. So they're kind of resurging this tradition of performing at union organizations. And in closing, I would like to acknowledge these 10 dancers by name. So their names are Sean J. Smith, Sierra Jones, Micah Isaiah, Terrell Rogers, Jillian Clifford, Dominic Lucky, Niall Ruff, Derek McCoy Jr., Elijah Lancaster, and Breon Sellers. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Colleen. So in my latest work, I've been studying the role of arts networks in cultural practice and performance. A current book in progress is called Groundwork, Race, Equity, and the National Performance Network. And that assesses the emergence, development, and aspirations of a networked or systems-based performance infrastructure, first imagined in the late 1970s, brought to fruition in the 1980s, and still in existence today. And if there's one more, post-com on that, based on the ideas of sort of campus organizing from the 1960s. So, working across multiple generations. With respect to value and mission, I see the organization as a good example of an organization moving into alignment with its career-long stated values about equity, racial and geographic. Since its inception, the New Orleans-based National Performance Network has provided more than $42 million in direct support to over 4,000 artist projects. In this room today, we have several artists and former board members who have worked with the organization. I have also served in both capacities. There are probably even more people who might have an opinion about the organization, right? For those who don't know the organization, the NPN operates as a hub or sort of organizing center to 60 diverse artist spaces located in urban and rural communities and ranging in size from two-person offices to large arts centers. The NPN's national network operations include a commissioning program for new performance work and a performance residency program for artists to work in the communities of the partner spaces, as well as an annual national conference of its partner spaces and artists working with them, along with a variety of other programs and services. So, even before, but especially since Hurricane Katrina in 2005, the NPN has also operated a dynamic local and regional program. And that accounts for more than half of its budget at this point goes to the local regional programs, and then half goes to the national programs. I'm talking about the national today. So, as I see it, and as it's been documented, the NPN has had a tremendous impact in the development of a national performance field in the U.S., especially for early and mid-career artists. And since the beginning, the organization has voiced cultural and geographic equity as just the core value. Now, I came to this project because I was interested in reading an arts network through the lens of network theories from social sciences, network and computer sciences, media studies, and philosophy, and seeing to what extent the system or systems-based approach made the field more dynamic, robust, knowable, or even trustworthy, right? This is keyword business, right? The NPN's deployment of the term network predates many of the more contemporary understandings of networks through network and computer sciences, but also social organization and common parlance. We're talking about the 80s, right? So we're not having social media or anything like that. Even more exciting, there was this prospect I could offer a teachable illustration of what we mean when we say systems-based approach. I wanted to offer something that could serve as an episteme, a way of knowing artistic practice and taking it into one's consciousness. Now, coming from performance and dance, I understand the value of rehearsal and studio practice. How do we put into teaching of infrastructure, how do we put that into the same exciting space of rehearsal that we afford our studio practices? That's a big question I always have. And what I've come to understand through the research, not only in the networks, but with the NPN's archives and 60 interviews with individuals associated with the organization, is that the organization is effectively balancing multiple types of networks. Its grant programs reflect a more hierarchical, centralized network approach, but its national convenings of artists and cultural organizations together affect decentralized networks, giving visibility to many sites of performance across the U.S. And going even further, the program commitments to residency opportunities make possibility highly distributive connections, not even with this center, but just people connecting to people. But I have often thought of the NPN as a funder or centralized network. And in that capacity, the NPN has recognized that the centralized systems approach, largely the residency and commissioning programs, failed for many years in providing equitable resourcing, particularly to BIPOC artists and spaces. So within the last 5 or 6 years, the organization pivoted to a focus on racial and social justice and prioritizing those programs that had been underserved within its network. Its mission and values, which again had been about equity since 1985, moved into alignment with practice. Now, interestingly, if I speak to artists and cultural spaces on the network, for the most part about the organization, they don't lead with the centralized funding program. They lean into the access afforded by a decentralized network of national conferences and the distributive networks of relationships built through organization and the commitment to each other over a regular calendar year. Just this cadence of opportunities to connect. In other words, they lean into the organization's very intimate side. They describe a performance infrastructure rooted in the kind of relationship building among cultural workers that artists often aspire to in artistic residencies. It means a lot to folks to have a renewable resource of validation and insight. It means a lot to have thought partners, colleagues, and friends in practice. It means a lot to have access to multiple nodes of opportunity at any one time so that if any one opportunity or resource dries up, one can jump into another opportunity, right? In other words, it means a lot to have other options. It means a lot to know that the system in place is growing in nodes all the time, no zero sum here, growth, and that it so that if even and then it's going to sort of just remain in place around these sort of core agreements to be together and to support each other. And also, for anyone already operating within, it's becoming a growing data bank of resources, a teaching moment, right? So the prospect of thinking that way really challenges me to consider how we should regard the infrastructure not only as the site of multiple equitable opportunities and fair contracts, but more so as a site of mutual care, shared cultivation and respect. And that mission and value can signal just not what is an offer, but also what is being asked. How does this become the part of the cycle of gifting and regifting? This is my transition. This actually, thank you. But I feel like we're talking on the same register. I mean, from the beginning, there are a couple of points that are coming clear to me, and I'd love for you to speak to them. It's this sense of like, fundamentally, people will come together. That, even in a time when we're thinking of slash resources or reorganization or, the threat, we're going to lean into each other as humans, right? We're also going to tell each other who we are, right? And we're going to lean into that discourse that represents really who we are. And that came up here too, where, there seemed to be a slight irony on the mission statement of the city of Dallas in that respect, right? And also that these programs are looking at legacies of people and long-standing relationships over time. I was wondering what stood out for you in these things.
Yes. I really want to hear you all talk more about this idea that Adam offered, and then I heard again throughout, that it didn't take a policy shift, but a practice shift. And that seemed to me to really go together with what you're talking about with centralized versus decentralized. So I just wanted people to talk more about decentralized versus centralized, especially because you said that the decentralized may have been invigorating, but it also created some noticeable racial inequity. So there's a kind of diligence and being diligent, I guess, about that if we're leaning into decentralized. But I just wondered if people would talk more about that. If we change our practices, maybe we don't have to focus on policy, but then how do we not give up on policy change? I don't know. I just want to put that out there.
Okay, thank you, Karitha. That's a great question. So I was thinking strategically from within this idea of unionizing and union organizing, and I think this idea of decentralized versus centralized is really pertinent right now because, one of my topics was the NLRB, right? What does the NLRB do? What can it do for artists and other workers? And right now, from the end of January until today, because of an illegal firing by the Trump administration, we are short. So right now there's only 2 members of the board and the NLRB cannot function, right? So we're in this situation where this organization that's meant to do certain things is not able to do them. And then we also had a February executive order where there's now a different set of oversights over the NLRB and a lot of other organizations that are supposed to function independently. They're not able to do that in this new executive order. So my point is that there is also these other ways to act. What we saw within the Dallas Black Dance Theater example is the reputational situation, right? So unions have long worked to basically bring reputations to different lights and basically damage reputations of organizations who don't have powerful worker-centered approaches. So we have reputation. We have also these ideas of a demonstration effect, which basically means once it has been seen that others can do something, then we see within the labor landscape a demonstration effect. Well, then I can do that as well. So these things operate independent of the broader political tides, and that there are different strategies that can be adapted even when the institutions themselves are actually unable to function. We can still focus on getting the word out about these situations and building upon the different progress that other workers have made.
Do you have something you want to say? No? Okay. This is putting me into a frame of mind thinking about sustaining connection. And I think this, it was very provocative, Paul, and brought together a lot of what I'd been hearing, that we come together in groups through the need to connect, through the need to share our stories, through the need for support and all kinds of things. And at some point, we need some kind of institutional support to stay together. So what you described, for example, at NPN is true of many networks in this mediating networks or service organizations, that at some point in the 80s, they went from being connectors and conveners and gatherers to being funders, or sort of unintentionally making that pivot, as opposed to the kind of intentionality of Hewlett, which is like steeped in thinking about its funding. And so then what happens is that unintentional move towards providing financial support to sustain community that can't always happen on its own brings to bear the structures that it grows out of, and the inequities that it doesn't know to consider maybe in the evolutionary phase of its change. I was thinking, because Derek Miller and Brian Herrera are here, during the pandemic, we came together with a group of 15 or so in-field artistic groups that were doing data research about inclusion within the theater generally and some other arts. And we created this website that still exists called countingtogether.org. It was artists counting inclusion, within their particular field. And it was housed at the Dramatists Guild, which then just let it sit there after we came together. We could not, as a community, stay banded after the pandemic in a way to hold it together. So there's now this portal with 15 different studies, most of which are no longer, up to date. So at a certain point, we needed institutional support to maintain the network. This group of artistic directors I was talking about, thanks to Mellon, we could get together. We could go on a retreat together to the Bay. We could be in space together, but we can't do that on our own. And especially when I think about the young dancers or it's like, who has the resources to maintain those connections?
I think what you're making me think about here is, in the language of movement organizers, I think they would reinterpret what you're describing, institutional support, as a potentially dangerous piece of progress, right? So the question, I think, is where do we draw the line between institutional support, institutional guidance, say, or partnership, or institutional capture? So part of what I think, Paul, that you're pointing to, which is very interesting to me, is the trajectory of NPN, right? Like that the message it's sending is one that we collectively as a field have an identity that we share, and that field of the us is growing, or that together we can help it grow or protect each other and sort of keep this thing we're doing strong, at least for those of us who are a part of it. And I guess one thing that I want to maybe poke at a little bit is, we're in a room where we all believe in the power of the arts. We've dedicated our lives to it to different degrees and in different ways. But what are the harms that are possible? Because I think when we talk about the dangers of institutional capture, I think what the real danger is, right, is replicating something that we don't fully understand and then repeating that harm over and over and over again until we get to things like my colleagues in our environment program would call the tragedy of the commons. So those individual actions, which all seem quite wise and perfect in a certain situation and time, at certain scales, they become brutally harmful. So I want to believe that all artistic activity is good. And Todd, I think you proposed that. And sometimes it's tough to think that, right? Because we know that these institutions have been arenas for harms, and whether that's inherent to the arts activity is questionable. I mean, we might just be looking at society as it takes place in our theaters and our rehearsal studios and jazz clubs and such. But that's inescapable. We can't pretend that this is a different place that we work in. So I guess I wonder, when we think about investing in support, what is the arrangement of people that will leave room for reflection, that will leave room for protest, that will leave room for disagreement, so that we can be sure we're not replicating harms over and over at scale?
So there are a couple of things that are coming up for me. I love an institution. I learn within an institution, right? And what an institution brings me is a lot of context-specific experience, practice, resources, and also just the opportunity to ground myself in a very specific history, which is otherwise a very confusing and expansive world, right? And at the same time, I'm highly aware that even within this room, I am connecting with people that I have known through other institutional moments that have long since gone away, but the bond remains, right? And we're all dreaming together in some way. And moreover, what I learned from them at that time, I'm getting to pick up again and learn some more, right? And so I keep wanting to back up from the institution itself to think of the people, and I'm wanting to think, what are the fundamentals, values, and missions towards each other, our sense of community, our experience, our recognition of each other's time, experience, and also just, again, I keep bringing it back to this professor role, how much context can I offer so they can see this incredible moment, right? I think I got, and I wanted to say that decentralized networks they balance the hierarchy and the non-hierarchical. It's the central ones that are really hierarchical and you kind of have to watch out for, and that's the funding system and the distributive system coming down from philanthropy, moving towards a decentralized system, although still incentivized here, still got the bag of potato chips we talked about earlier, right? They're the ones that are beginning to allow for solutions in other places, right? And so I do believe in that, right? I do believe in that renewal. But I also know, and I do believe like there's a fundamental journey that has to happen with anyone emerging into practice to think all of a sudden, it's not just about me. It's this person who has kept this space open. It is this community that I'm connecting with. It is what, you know what I mean? And like begin to take the gift, right? What I also know is that sometimes those nodes of opportunity are not apparent until we creatively think outside the institution. I feel like you were doing that when you're talking about the spaces and the housing with, it sounded like artists had owned it, or like you're opening up a space that was like this asset that we hadn't thought of, right? And yeah, so talk about that kind of creative thinking. And
well, I take no credit for the things that our grantees do, first of all. I think I'm asking myself, trying to respond to your question and buying time, what are the conditions in which people can come up with new ideas, try them out, and therefore identify these opportunities, right, that maybe were not within the purview of arts organizations as we know them, arts philanthropy as we know it, arts education and research and teaching. And it's sort of like when, coming from music, right, someone puts out a recording, they get some popularity, and then everyone expects them to release the next recording that sounds just like the last one. What is the practice that allows them to engage in life as they knew it before, not as the person who's supposed to make the next thing that sounds just like the last thing? So to the Artist Space Trust, I think what we have in the Bay Area in that case is a multi-generational movement, like the land trust movement on its own, separate from any sort of utility in the arts, right? As a response to private property ownership, like as the big system that we're operating within, and a sense that real estate speculation is having all these harmful effects on local communities. So I think that the tough thing about it, at least for me personally, is I don't know much about real estate. I don't know much about housing policy, and yet this is the issue that is pushing so hard on artists that they're saying, I can't live in the Bay Area where my family and community is. It's just too hard. I can't do it. I think forums like this one, but maybe not in the arts, are the place where innovators like the folks leading Artist Space Trust have found that spark of cross-sector invention. This just opens their mind to say, well, maybe it's not, taking like what Westbeth did in New York City and doing that in San Francisco, although that is also happening and very important. Maybe there's room to borrow a page out of the book of Back to the Land movement and try that for artists, or try to make sure that artists are visible and can access affordable housing policies that are already in place. Some of that work is also happening in California. So a little bit of that cross-sector learning, I think, and being humble about what we do and don't know helps engage in those larger systems that we're all contending with, I would say. And I think it also speaks to something that's coming up for me, which is this question of the line between individual identity, individual learning, and organizational identity and learning. And I think in our field, it is a particularly fine line. in large part because of the curatorial identities that are put forward and promoted as the key kind of fundraising mechanism. You know, whether we're talking about music, theater companies, dance artists, right? It's often the person's name. It's often that person's time and vision around which value is built. So I think that's got great benefits because it helps invite a conversation about aesthetics, about practice, about artistic achievement. But the downside is that, you know, we're talking about individuals here, so all the compulsions and biases of individual leaders come into play. So when you talk about decentralization, I often think about the work we've been doing around decentralized leadership, which also, you know, one of the big lessons there, I think, is it's not an institutional answer. It's really about the individuals who sit in those positions to define, you know, if you're going to have a co-executive director model, what are the roles? How do you divide up the roles? And the response is almost uniformly, it just depends on the humans who are in those jobs.
Well, I'm thinking about learning, and it seems like there are learning and legibility, actually, to these systems. But, you know, one of the things that I was hearing, I made notes, is like, in the theater, one thing that we don't actually teach is how to work with each other. We assign roles, and you learn how to work within those roles. But the sort of underlying systems of collaboration are rarely investigated, in my experience. You know, I'm interested in the artist trust because that notion of cross-generational collaboration, but also learning. I've been really struck by how little there are, how few venues there are for artists of different generations to really sit with each other and learn from each other rather than to disparage each other from their point of view. And then finally, Adam, to your notion of like, how do we address harm in the theater, at least? I don't know about other fields. We don't have actually mechanisms for community or restorative justice. You know, we don't have a conversation in the professional theater, except in certain corners, about how we do that. And yet, you know, many of the artistic directors that I was talking about took over from people who lost their jobs because of abuse. But do we just forget about that? Do we just pretend that it's a board issue? How do we, what are the mechanisms? What are the internal LRBs? And so it feels like there are opportunities for mechanisms of learning about connection and sustaining connection. And even like, I want to know from the Huntington, at the end of Empinoso's, 9-play cycle, how those partnerships were formed, what we can learn from that, how that can be taken elsewhere. But we move on,
Thank you. You have that experience where I feel like you're saying this cultural practice that is happening locally is making the city legible to you. Oh, sorry. You have this experience right now where, this transition into a new city and these cultural practices and this sort of invitation is making a city legible to you. On what registers is it working? What are you feeling?
I would say that I'm blown away by exactly the issue you just raised, which is it has me very curious about how those relationships were formed so that so many institutions came together and that so many institutions came together, and it's making me want to think very seriously about the fact that we are all, no matter who we are, dealing with the ramifications of the pandemic. And so it's making me kind of try to be deliberate about thinking about what am I out of practice doing in terms of making human connections. And so I'm using examples like the Huntington to be a way for me to think seriously about, what are the times that I have been more dismissive than I should have been about, like, a politician, for example. Like, how can I think much more rigorously so that the cross, all of these cross industry, cross arena, like, that's what you all make clear to me, the importance of thinking seriously about the people who are not in your arena, don't immediately have your same vocabulary, that kind of thing. And so I think that that's part of what it is, that having that 9-play cycle in my head then made my experience at the Boston Athenaeum different, because it made me pay attention in a different way to the way that I was interacting with the people who, protect those really rare books and so on. It had me thinking differently about them, especially when I had other opportunities to go to like a reception that they held there, and thinking about who are these other people who were invited in the space, and how can I be more deliberate if I want to be a champion for artists? How can I be more deliberate about how I'm interacting with them? And I mean, the other part about it, of course, is how do I be deliberate so that I can also create more and more opportunities for the students who are in my orbit, that it's not just reliant on my reputation in my own field, but that I'm thinking very seriously about my responsibility to be a world citizen. And I feel like you all model how much that takes in terms of taking seriously people who are outside of your comfort zone and being aware of when you're, I go back to the cancer crab thing, like my needing to be aware of wanting to close off, but especially in a moment like this where everything is under attack, it's so important that I deliberately practice not closing down. So that's, I feel, what I'm learning from you all in terms of this focus on infrastructure.
Yeah, it does seem like the organization is putting you on a shared journey with all the people who are coming to it, right? And so all of a sudden, the reception itself is an opportunity, like, we've already started the conversation. It happened as audience members, as spectators, as people willing to come in today and just be present, right?
Yeah, thank you so much. I have one question for our group here. I was really curious about Adam's words about institutional support, the possibility of institutional capture and what that could look like, possible harms there. And so I'm curious what the potentials are for moving across institutions, like what types of movement do we see possible? And also back to what Paul was talking about, moving beyond the individual. So how does moving beyond the individual make it possible to move between institutions? And then finally, what Caritha was just talking about, translating to people across different arenas. I think that that is so powerful. I'm really finding myself going deep into these different council members and their dialogue and what does it mean, and how do these words translate into artistic support, and how do we find any core values that may triangulate with things that matter to me, right? Those translations seem so important. So does anyone want to speak on any of those topics? Moving across institutions, translation, and also moving beyond the individual.
I'll respond really briefly. Colleen, your story, especially when we got to the point about the values of the city of Dallas, reminded me very much of the advocacy that BAM has been involved in. And one of the projects that's been under discussion and work for many years is the repurposing of a building that the property is owned by the city of Oakland. And so what your listing of the city of Dallas's values really reminded me of was that negotiation, for lack of a better word, on the level of values, right? And how that provides the ground for agreements, for partnerships, and for sort of mutual achievement. And in this case, there was a community benefit agreement established between the private developer, the city of Oakland, and the CBA created this sort of channel for local community groups, which BAM was leading, to have a say in what happened with that building. Over time, conditions change, and not everyone is able to. All parties, I think, were not able to sort of live into that agreement. So your question sort of brings me to that point of wondering, like, when we say things like we value ethics. Ethics is a category. It's not like one code, right? Everyone's got their own code. So how do you discern through actions, through words, through shifting attitudes maybe, when you're in alignment and when you're not? And so I think that's an instance where all those parties sort of found themselves either unable to state what their ethical code was, or maybe had guessed wrong about what the other partner was up to and how they would respond to changing conditions. So I think, my lesson or my takeaway from that is you can always try. Trust is sort of the 2 or 3-way street, depending on where you are. But only time really proves it, right?
I have a very incomplete set of thoughts. One is that what we're increasingly up against, and I think, Colleen, your example is a perfect example of this, is a kind of burgeoned institutional protectionism. I mean, I don't know when NDAs entered the nonprofit arts, but it seems like everyone I know these days has signed one for something. When did that happen in the theater? You know what I mean? When did it happen that boards are making decisions about real estate that mean that they're relieving artists of their leadership positions, as has happened in at least 2 theaters in Chicago? That said, I'm thinking, I have a wonderful project that I love working with the National Asian American Theater Company of New York, which is a small, really small, mighty 30-year-old company that is doing a national partnership project with now 5 partners across the country to sort of permeate their value systems, to increase staffing, hiring, and leadership of Asian American artists in those theaters. And it's a multi-year program. And the first maybe 5 years of that program was about identifying partners or potential partners whose values did align, who wanted to do that very thing with this very company and that very, company of people. And it's, so the sort of groundwork of, the way that you talk about like NPN, the NPN, the way that they grew out of a network early on and then defined as they went. I think that's true with all collaborative partnerships. And so how do we create the time and space necessary to identify allies and then to learn to speak to each other before we start making things,
One of the things that's coming up for me, and I get it from reading your work as well, just like, the sense that sometimes when you're talking about know your player's aggression and some of the other things, and what's coming up in the stories I'm hearing is, it's really, the key word ends up accountability, right? And all that entails, in the sense that if the value and mission is to do these good things or to do these things we care about and we're being transparent about it, then we can also have the security to, on occasion, say when we needed to course correct, when we weren't correct on this, when we were accountable. I think one of the hardest things for me coming out of the election was this argument that voters did not want to, they wanted a leader who was never wrong, did not say, I'm sorry, did not, whatever. And I as a teacher even, I'm always thinking it's so important just to remain a human in the room if I want to create a new generation, support that kind of building up of a field that is accountable to each other, right? I have to say, this is an ongoing learning process, and it's only going to get better the more I set up those systems of trust in which you can, we can work together to build something. I mean, this is what's sad, is in this performance of a public sort of firing and defunding and everything like that. You know, we're getting the flat characters of a melodrama as opposed to like a three-dimensional character. Nobody's learning. Yeah. So that's what's exciting to me about coming into the work, because I felt like the organization had found ways consistently to be accountable. Even if it fails on other people's registers or something, even if it's not everybody's thing or it's not the newest thing to do, it is trying to stay in by being accountable. And, you know, I see that as the collective action. Should we transition into the, yeah.
I think so. Okay, we're transitioning. So we are going to end this session with a brief acknowledgement, which is going to be dedicated to how we can manifest infrastructural equity in practical terms. So the panelists are invited to offer up value propositions and or revised missions. So some of this could address financial, racial, social, cultural, and climate justice factors in our statements of how we want to move towards infrastructural equity in the performing arts.
I'll just say briefly, and I say this cognizant of the importance of an issue that we've brought up, which is how do we think beyond the individual? So that's my kind of caveat of what I wanted to offer. The kind of value statement or challenge that I want to issue has to do with the power of thinking about not simply your disadvantages in this unjust system, not just your disadvantages, but the unearned advantages that you might benefit from. And as a practice, like, what would happen if on a semi-regular basis, you really thought about what those unearned advantages were and how that paved the way for where you are and what you're doing. Because if we take some time to reflect on that, I think we get more creative about how to take action in the spaces that we enter. And so I offer that as one of the ways that I have found that I've been able to have a kind of mission-driven framework that can dictate all kinds of different practices. So if that is my mission-driven framework, then it's my job to think about, okay, what were my unearned advantages that got me in this room that I should be trying to make more space for someone who didn't have that unearned advantage, right? So that's part of the way I think in terms of cis identity versus trans identity, for example. So I offer that as a kind of mission framework that can dictate all kinds of practices for the rest of our days.
I'm going to go sooner since I made other people talk sooner last time. Yeah, you did. Yeah. You know, mission and values always comes up as a sort of a wonderful, lofty statement in some program. And I realize today how much I am aching for context, how much I need a story, how much I lean into and learn from narrative. And, you know, just as you might end a dinner talking about what you've been reading and the greatest novel or whatever, I noticed that every time I've really felt like I got a better understanding of policy or practice or the field was when I had a really great story to attach to it, right? And I knew the players, I saw them as multidimensional individuals. There was a chance to be just a learning witness, a recipient of this generosity of experience, right? And then an invitation to come in. Right. So I keep thinking, and I've, you know, how do we make this kind of notion of value and mission really something that is felt as a lived experience or a potentially lived experience that a person can enter into? Yeah.
Maybe somewhat appropriately, I'm trying to think of how to answer this question as an individual, but also on behalf of the foundation. And, you know, I think one of the interesting experiences about working in philanthropy is the tools are so limited. we have dollars, and that's pretty much the end of it. Our time and dollars. So I'm trying to turn off the artistry part of how I want to respond and just say that in the big picture, not just in the performing arts, what Hewlett does is invest in leaders in our various fields. And only through those humans do we think that change can be durable. I mean, there's lots of other ways to affect change that is fast and short term, but it really does take that good story, the warm welcome, the long-term transformation, right, for change to stick. So I think whether, in my strategy, we're investing in artists and culture bearers as the leaders in our society, or in other fields, it looks a little different, but I think that commitment then is to continue to invest, but to also be there to learn as they learn, to not expect perfection, to know that people are working with the information and networks they have in their contexts, to believe in that, to be a partner to it, to support it, and then to try to stay next to them as they learn and see what went well and what really went wrong, and hopefully be open to being a partner in the thinking through.
Can I let you go last? Because then
Yes.
you have the burden of that. I don't have a really cogent idea, but I do think that, because we're operating in a capitalist system, we are always operating, especially in the arts, out of not having enough. And therefore, in a way, in competition with each other. And so I'm looking for ways where we can sit together and feel sufficient, where we can identify all the things we bring to rooms and call it enough, and then learn from each other. And one of the things that we have done, at least in the arts, the part of the arts world that I've been lucky to be part of, is we've learned some things about facilitation. We've learned a lot about process. And what we haven't quite done, because we've been in our separate silos, even in networks, is turn those skills on ourselves to sort of self-evaluate, to really ask the questions, including about, what we bring, what our privileges are, what our, what we add to each other and what we take away and where we can do better. So this notion of learning from within is really sort of popping in my mind on this panel.
Thank you, Todd. Okay. Yes, I'm really inspired by all of the things that the panelists have brought up today. And some of the things that are sitting with me would be the three-dimensionality that Paul mentioned, because what I presented today does very much read as a melodrama. And so I'm interested in bringing that dimensionality to it. And it also goes back to Todd's statement about intergenerational learning, because what I portrayed is a lot about a conflict between generations. And so that's one thing I really want to take from this conversation, is this possibility of intergenerational learning. And then what you were saying about staying next to them as they learn, I also felt was really powerful and could be another place where we could possibly move from institutional protectivism towards staying next to leaders as they learn. And this space of possibly even ways of addressing harm and creating individualized plans for restorative justice, because obviously the NLRB is not going to do all that work for us, right? So those are some of the takeaways that I had from this group, and I'm very grateful to have been part of this conversation.
Everyone. I'm Derek Miller. I'm a member of this research group that is convening things. I'm the facilitator of our next session at 1 p.m. on data and story. So let's again thank everyone who participated in this morning's first session. A wonderful conversation. If you have questions and are watching on the live stream, or a member of the audience and want to post a question, you can do so using the QR codes that are available in various places, physical and virtual. So at this time, we invite everyone present here in Austin to adjourn with us for lunch on the second floor atrium in the Harry Ransom Center. And if you're on the live stream, please tune back in at 1 p.m. Central Time for our first of 2 afternoon sessions. Thank you all very much.
danço samba, só danço samba. Vai, 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 vai. Só danço samba, só danço samba. Vai. Só danço samba, só danço samba. Vai, 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 vai. Só danço samba, vai. Já dancei o twist até demais, mas não sei, me cansei do calypso ao tchá-tchá-tchá. Só danço samba, só danço samba. Vai, 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 vai. Só danço samba, vai.